All right. Thank you so much for being here. If everyone wants to find a seat. My name is Reverend Sadie Cullenber, and I'm the senior pastor here at Harbor Christian Church. And I just wanted to very quickly look around the room and welcome every single one of you to our space. We are so glad to host such an important event and to open our doors to the community. I just wanted to give you a couple of quick things. Some of you have already found our restrooms. They are just outside the back and to the left. There are 2 all-gender bathrooms. If you come upon the bathroom and it's locked, it means that someone's in there. So just wait for a moment. Once you're inside the bathroom, there's a way to lock it up high just by flipping a thing over so you don't get walked in on. So just make sure you do that. And mostly I just want to say it's so wonderful to see your beautiful faces. Thank you for being here and being present for this event. We hope that you enjoy it. We hope that you enjoy some special snacks that are prepared over here for us in a moment, very lovingly by our church community who couldn't all be here today, but wants you all to know thank you for being here and welcome.
Excellent. Welcome, everybody. My name's Adam Overton. I'm with CLUE, Faith-Rooted Organizer, Clergy and Lady United for Economic Justice. And thank you for being here for Reparations Now, a faith-rooted conversation on the California Reparations Task Force findings, proposals, and next steps. And before we get into anything, we're going to have a wonderful song from our friend James Tyler Jr.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I threatened to upset everybody and have you all move over here together, but it looks like the crowd is going to be balanced pretty well, so I'll leave you where you are. For the opening hymn, Lift Every Voice. It's by James Weldon Johnson, the African-American poet, but I think you'll find the words are universal in their appeal. Now, on the second verse, I would like the ladies to sing that first half, and the men will come in on that lower part, and we'll all sing in unison the first and the last verse. And stand as you are able, please.
My name is Caroline C. Kaufman. I'm with the Fund for Reparations Now, and I'm an elder here at Harbor Christian. Welcome. Speaking of truth to our native land, it is my privilege to get to share a land and labor acknowledgement with you. As we begin this morning's program, I will lead a land and labor recognition statement adapted from a fellow Muslim sister, Melina Abdullah of Black Lives Matter, Los Angeles. I will pause for a moment of silence so we can reflect upon these words. We acknowledge that this land, which we inhabit in Southern California, is physically situated in the original ancestral homelands of the Tongva, Juaneño, and Luiseño peoples, the Ahachiman. We pay respect to these people and all indigenous people, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout their historical diaspora. We pay homage to those who were stolen from Africa, placed in bondage, falsely named as chattel, and forced into labor, who were called slaves, but never submitted to such, and have always been fully human, with an unbroken connection to the divine and to each other. We honor our African ancestors for the still unpaid labor which built what is now the Americas. To both our indigenous and African forebearers, we commit to the continued struggle for liberation and reparations, for it is only through freedom and justice that we truly give honor.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you so much, Brother James Tyler, for the wonderful music. Thank you all for being here and for your wonderful voices and your hearts and coming here today. Assalamu alaikum, shalom, greetings. Today, we're having our program, Reparations Now, a faith-rooted conversation on the California Reparations Task Force findings, proposals, and next steps. And things have been really heavy this week, so we just want you to know that, and maybe we can just for a moment take another moment of silence in recognition of our friends and loved ones in Israel and Gaza and across the world who are hurting and have been lost. And if we could just pause for a moment of silence. With all the pain we've been experiencing right now, especially this week, and with divisions within our own interfaith community ever widening, it's really easy to feel helpless and hopeless, but it's amidst these seemingly irreparable brokenness that we're experiencing today that Clue is hosting this faith-rooted conversation on a breathtaking California plan to finally achieve substantial historic reparations for those who are so harmed by this nation's evil legacy of slavery. And beginning next year, we will begin a legislative process here that could result in achieving repairs that most people have never thought possible. We need in our society more examples of repair, campaigns for healing. We need ones that succeed in order to fuel our hopes for repair and in other seemingly hopeless struggles. We hope that in coming here today to hear this plan ahead, that you're joining us in this sacred struggle, and that we hope that this rekindles everyone's belief that those generations ahead of us, that they can see that meaningful reparations are possible and worth fighting for everywhere. The Orange County Interfaith Racial Justice Network aims to serve as the connective tissue for bringing together our respective faith-rooted anti-racism communities alongside Black, Indigenous, people of color-led racial justice organizations who are doing urgent, real-time, on-the-ground advocacy to dismantle white supremacy in our county, Orange County, in our state, and beyond. We work to educate, agitate, and organize local anti-racists of faith so that we might be respectful and effective allies for the BIPOC communities leading the racial justice movement here. We also work to educate our racial justice partners about the history and power of organizing faith community into this movement. Our network focuses primarily on nonviolent local and state efforts to end or lessen the harms of incarceration, policing, hate, and structural racism. CLUE in Orange County encourages faith community leaders and activists whose hearts are called to engage in this struggle against racial injustice to join our mailing list and our bi-monthly meetings to receive updates and action items from our various partners and to better know one another across denomination, across religion, so that we can work together to win this fight and combine forces. For now, if anyone is interested in getting involved, please just reach out to me. For today's event, we are here because an incredible thing happened on June 29th, 2023. The California Task Force to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans issued its final report to the California Legislature. That final report, over 1,000 pages, surveys the ongoing and compounding harms experienced by African Americans as a result of slavery and its lingering effects on American society today, and proposes a comprehensive reparations plan for state legislators and citizens to enact. I believe there are over 100 different legislative recommendations that it makes, and they all make complete sense. So today we're going to be hearing about that. We have gathered some really incredible folks to hear from. And besides just the incredible speakers who are about to come up, I want y'all just to look around and see every single one of you as an anti-racist of faith or an ally, a racial justice worker who has been part of this conversation directly. There are almost no folks in here who just randomly walked off the street. These are all folks who are doing the work. And they're folks who are in different religions than you and different denominations from you. And we encourage you by 5 p.m., please gather as many phone numbers and emails as possible before you leave and set a meeting to meet for coffee and get to know your allies. This struggle for reparations really begins legislatively next year, but it could take decades, it could take a century, we may not get anything, or we may not get everything that is right, but we're going to start that process. And hopefully we'll be able to see some of the fruit of the labor that we're about to put into it within our own lifetimes. But it could take that long. And so these are some of your other Orange County brothers, sisters, and siblings who are going to be fighting all this together. So we're going to be hearing in a little bit from the incredible Kamilah Moore, who is the chair of the California Reparations Task Force. She's on her way from a memorial. And so we're actually going to be moving the program around just a little bit. But basically what we'll be doing first is we'll be hearing from the lovely Miss Sister Bayina, Peacock Secrets, a poem in just a moment, followed by, we'll be then hearing from two of our esteemed and amazing faith community leaders, Brother Gernaro, Waheed, and Reverend Lamont Hartman. Then we'll be hearing from Kamilah Moore. She's gotten here from the memorial yet. And then we're going to be doing a breakout session over there and then coming back. I just want to warn you that y'all are going to have all sorts of questions. I want to put your hands in the air. But what we're going to do is we ask you to save your questions. What's going to happen is, folks, the questions that you have, y'all are going to talk about those and come up with your list when you're in your breakout rooms. And then when we come back, we will come and ask those questions and give reflections to our incredible panel. So, and if you notice, there's a nice little empty sheet on the back of your packet, and some pens back there if you want to be taking any notes or ideas or things like that. So anyways, let's get started. Thank you so much for being here, and it's my incredible privilege to introduce Sister Peacock Secrets.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Clue, for inviting me. This particular poem is called Tell Them That by Peacock Secrets Poetry. Someone travel to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s museum. Give him the news. 60 years, your dream still ain't never came true. The U.S. will use guns to lynch Medgar Evers, Malik el-Shabazz, and then you. Someone go to Justice Thurgood Marshall's former chambers in the Supreme Court. It's been 69 years since the desegregation of education, but from the moment when they murdered the martyrs, they've been resegregating the system. Hence, it's more segregated today than during Malcolm X's days. Bigotry training, free for your children. Hey, you. Go ask after Huey P. Newton's endangered and extinct panthers. Tell them we said these police are at it again, shooting us inside and beside our beds. Ayana, Brianna, a Tatiana, women and a little girl, slain like Black Panther Chairman Fred Hampton. Corrupt coppers who are jealous of bronze say it's impossible to pronounce power to the people if there are bullets in our mouths. Thus they arm and train their arms to aim for our vocal cords, our lips, our tongues, our teeth, each weapon we train to speak, trying to help unarmed Black folks get back home. Who's going to go to the grave, say, dear Mr. Sidney Poitier, the Oscars, Tonys, and Grammys are still whiter than the industry's hidden hoods and robes. Hell, even the globes are about as white as the pearly teeth of Kunta Kinte. Someone go say to Kwame Ture, your phrase, Black power, was blackballed and blacklisted. Like all Black liberators, it's been lambasted and cast aside. We used to want equal power. Now we march just to matter. Someone race across the bridge. Tell Olympians John Carlos and Tommy Smith. Tell those living legends this: we still raise your fist, but we can't breathe. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. We're gonna, oh, and by the way, Peacock Secrets has some books at the back. As you're leaving later today, feel free to take a look and see if you'd like to purchase some more of her incredible poetry. I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Brother Gernaro Waheed, a friend of ours. Let me read your bio real quick. Hold on, I haven't memorized it yet. So Gernaro Waheed is a leader in the Southern California Muslim community. Gernaro reverted to Islam in 1998, a Sunday school teacher, founder of Waheed LLC, working to empower African American males, co-founder of Sahaba Initiative, ignites change through service. With your help, we can change lives, build strong families, and inspire hope for a thriving community. Board President of Inland Congregations United for Change, ICUC, empowers people of faith to transform and revitalize the Inland Empire by working in the civic arena for the common good. Gernaro also serves as Vice President of Riverside Interfaith Council and is a father, husband, and brother. Welcome, Gernaro.
Assalamu alaikum. Greetings, peace, blessings to everyone. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. In the name of God, the most gracious, most merciful, I seek refuge from their cursed shaitan. I came here with a little apprehension. The ideal of reparation is something that's always going to be dear to the hearts of the people who suffer. The ideal of getting what is owed to you is always something that is dear to the heart of people who are suffering, right? So when you think of reparations, I never liked the ideal of saying reparations because it's kind of the powerful is actually giving you what they took, which can't be given back. So it's kind of hard to talk about it. But I look at it in an Islamic sense. More of a concept that we talk about in Islam is called, dhum. It's a word we use. In the original time I read it is in a verse of Quran when we talk about the people of Pharaoh, which is very ironic today. We look at oppressed people. But dhum doesn't exactly translate into oppress and oppression, although if you look it up, it'll say oppression. But dhum, it doesn't have the duality. It doesn't, like you'll say oppress, and then you'll look over and say, then this is the oppressor and this is the oppressed. But dhum doesn't have that connotation. It doesn't have the opposites, the polars. It only has one theme. It has the understanding that the people who are oppressed and the people who are oppressing has a similar obligation to God. They have a similar obligation to God. If we remember the story of Musa, which we have it in a three-faith tradition, the story of Moses, he goes to the Pharaoh and says, let's God people go. The obligation of Pharaoh to release the people is under the same obligation Moses have to come give the Pharaoh the message to let the people go. And Pharaoh has the obligation to obey because this is God's commandment. So the dhum that the Pharaoh created in his system is the dhum that the people of Israel didn't have the power and strength to fight against, although they held accountable to fight against it. Sounds complicated, right? The ideal that the people who are getting oppressed has the obligation to stop the oppressor and turn them back to God. This shows in this concept that there is, although there might look like there's two opposite parties here, those who's getting oppressed and those who are being oppressed, the same obligation under the same God is still to worship that God, and they're both can be sinners if they don't fix that problem. As long as we allow the oppression, we are part of the problem of oppression. So getting back to the story of Moses, and if you look at the system of Dhalam or the system of Dhum, or you look at that system, you start to realize that what Moses and his people went through is what is called a stratification, which was we separate you from them. But what they created is the polar opposite of polar opposites here. The good becomes the Pharaoh, and the bad becomes the Israelites. So everything that associates with good is Pharaoh-like. Everything that's associated with bad is Israelite. And when the Zoom system is applied, it's the top-down system. So the Pharaoh creates the rules and the legislation, and it trickles down. So it goes from the administration, right, the Pharaoh's house and the legislative board and all these other things, down further down to maybe the street cop or the person that watched the block. It trickles down from them to even the households, the mothers and the fathers. It trickles down to even the children when they're in school and this kid's teasing this kid because he looks more like an Israelite. This is what you see with the Zoom system. It trickles down and everybody get infested or infected with this Zoom. And in order to get a strategic upper hand, I need to look more like the Pharaoh or the Pharaoh's people. I need to act more like the Pharaoh or the Pharaoh's people. This kind of Zoom, this type of system infects people where they don't want to look like themselves. They don't want to be themselves. They want to aim closer to what the Pharaoh and his people are. Because of this Zoom system, we can see the similarities today. Some people ask about religious understanding of reparations, and I look like we have a human obligations to fix problems because we are affected by the problems. When you look at slavery, one of the biggest arguments these people had with slavery was like, this make white people look bad. And I laughed a lot of time when I heard that, when I read it. I didn't hear it because I wasn't there. When I read this, it baffled me. So I read deeper into this. And it's that you cannot oppress a people without changing your dynamics within yourself. You can't kill a person and not see the human within yourself dying itself. You can't commit all kinds of atrocities, rape, robbery, and abuse without feeling that yourself. I have many of friends participated in many of these wars, and they all come back with the same look on their face of trauma. You can't experience this and take part in this. When we talk about victimization, there's always multiple people in the victimization. It's the person perpetrating it. Also, it's the person that's getting it perpetrated against. And also, it's the people who see it. In the system of oppression, you start to realize something very clear, that if you witness the oppression, a part of you dies too. Because even if you're a white person witnessing another person getting oppressed, you realize if you don't follow this unjust system, that could be you. It creates the system of fear. It forces this assimilation, this unspoken word of trauma upon all the people. When we're talking about repairing, in a religious understanding of repairing, it's about repentance. It's about asking for forgiveness for what part we played in this, as churches, as institutions. Because no one's hands are clean of oppression. If we watched a murder in front of us and we did nothing, how would you feel your hands are clean? How would you feel guiltless when you took part in it? As he said, accomplished before and after. That's the way the law says, I heard before, right? If you watched the crime, you didn't tell nobody, you didn't try to stop it. We all participate. And this is where the ideal of Zoom comes from. The ideal of multiple people participating. If you spend any time with me, you'll hear me say something which for me meant a lot, is when someone says something out loud. When you say out loud injustice, wrong, racism, hatred, bigotry, you say it out loud, it's no longer your problem, it is our problem. Because there has to be a commitment to solving these problems. And the first commitment is when it's brung to you. So as I reflect and think about the struggle of Moses and the struggle of other people in South Africa and other people who suffer from these apartheid systems or these systems of oppression, I always remember that in my faith tradition, it is part of my obligation to stand up for it and stand up against it, to be at least the one person saying that's wrong if that's the least I can do. Not agreeing and passively agreeing to take part in the oppression of others. Whether it's the native people of the land, all the way to the handicapped, to any of these gender or any of these other things that we come up and call titles to. We put names to things to make us feel better about it, but if wrong is wrong and hurting people is hurting people. I have always believed that the struggle of humanity is to see each other with love and compassion and realize that God put you here for a reason and no one has the right to take that away from you. So some of these ideals of reparations, I tried to read the 1,000 pages, but I didn't get that far. But I did go over it. And as you go over it, you're like, yeah, they should do that. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yes, they should, all the, yeah. But when I listen to the sister poem, I'm like, yes, they still redline, right? Housing. You go to LA, the number of African Americans that are homeless, I can't even say double or triple the amount of the population because it is like 100 and something percent more than the population. It's almost 70 to 80% of the population of homeless. When you look at the incarceration rate, I talked to another individual and I was talking about doing, dawa, or what we call, talking to people about the religion. And he said, yes, we have a prison outreach program. I'm like, every black person isn't in prison, so why are we out talking about black people in prison outreach program? If we go to the people before they get to prison, we can actually prevent them from going. So what are you talking about? When you got to deal with these type of circumstances inside not only your religion, but also inside your community, when you think about fixing the problem, is by addressing the problem, not about addressing the things that cause the problem itself. Some of these ideals that we have sometimes are developed in these, once again, this is the poem, in these educational systems of oppression. So much so, the kids are teased about their color, you're too dark, you're this, you're that. And like Malcolm X, imagine the power he would have had if he wasn't criminalized before he became a criminal. Think about that. We have giants in this society that developed into huge things and empires of knowledge and understanding, from that peanut guy that we think about all the time, who was a botanist, who created more than just the peanut. But all these individuals, if they were allowed to get their hands and actually do what they were doing, think of how great this nation would be. It's maddening in a lot of sense to ask for reparations in a system where you should think they should at least stop the oppression before we talk about paying back for the oppression. But I'm so happy that we're doing something, and something is better than nothing, and I want to encourage everybody to move forward. But when you look at this, if you look at African Americans and we're talking about reparation and we have like this frustrated look on our face, if we're in the room, we're here to solve the problem. But at the same time, don't get mad because we're frustrated because it shouldn't have been a problem in the first place. So I'm going to go ahead and end there, even though, I can spill off and say more. But thank you again for inviting me.
right. Thank you so much, Brother Gernaro. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Reverend Lamont Hartman is the founding pastor of the Reconcile Church, a multi-ethnic, multi-generational church plant in Southern California. His desire is to see people live out the ministry of reconciliation, seeing people reconciled to God and to one another and to the local church. Lamont is father to 3 beautiful children, Selah, Elise, and Jackson. For a piece of candy or anything sweet, his kids will quote Bible verses. We welcome you to the podium, Reverend Lamont.
It is good to be here this afternoon. I'm not sure my son Jackson is over there, and I'm not sure he'll quote any scriptures today, given that he doesn't want to be here, but thus is the life of a pastor. I am honored to be here amongst you. I'm here as a learner as much as anyone else, and just thank you, Reverend, for opening up your doors here, and would love to say, Brother Waheed, thank you for all of your words. I concur with all of your words. It resonates as a African American man living in America. With that, I am a pastor of a church. I am a husband and a father of 3 black children and a follower of Jesus Christ, and much like my brother Waheed, have struggled to change systems within my faith context and to bring about the plight of African Americans in this country. So this topic of reparations is very important to me, and again, I concur. I did not read all 1,000 pages. I've read 1,000 pages on my doctorate degree, and that's all I'm worried about right now, but I'll get to it. I have to be honest. Maybe one of the reasons, not that I'm so busy reading other literature, but there is a despair that resides inside of me. There is a hopelessness that is inside of me because I have longed to see people that look like me be made whole to a degree in this country. I had this same hopelessness when it comes to talking about there ever being a black leader of this country, President Barack Obama. And that actually is where my hope, I believe that reparation, and these trickles of hope that we find in our faith, these pieces of hope that we can grab to and believe that change can come and will come. It's not only, this topic of reparations is not only important to me because of being a black man in this country, but it's important to me because of my faith. I not only believe that reparations is in order for black folks, but I'm convicted by the church's lack of engagement on this matter. I recognize that I'm speaking I'm speaking to and in front of many people from many different faith traditions. And so I hope that I could offer an apologetic to your conversations that you may have with Christian friends, an apologetic, a framework around a biblical discussion around this topic of reparations. That's my hope, that's my aim. I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'll try to be quick. I want to be clear this afternoon that the Bible doesn't specifically use the term reparations. It does, though, offer principles that address correcting wrongs, providing for the marginalized, and achieving a just society. The Bible actually uses the term restitution. Restitution is restoring to the rightful owner what has been lost or taken away. In the Bible, it is the act of making amends for a wrong one has done by paying money to otherwise helping those who have been wronged. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about the Bible because as Christians always use the Bible to justify their own sins, their own inaction. And so, as an apologetic, I want to give you something that you can help Christians open their eyes to the plot of, particularly in this conversation, African Americans in America. So please, I had my time this morning. I've been preaching all day, so this is not my pulpit. I'm just offering something today, hopefully for discussion, hopefully something of value. Context of restitution is mentioned in Exodus 22. If you would allow me, I just want to read it, not to Bible thump you at all, but to give context. Whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it, sells it must pay back five head of cattle for the ox, or four sheep for the sheep. If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the offender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, the offender is guilty of bloodshed. Anyone who steals must certainly make restitution. But if they have nothing, they must be sold into theft. If the stolen animal is found alive in their possession, whoever, whether ox or donkey or sheep, they must pay back double. If anyone grazes their livestock in a field or vineyard and lets them stray, they graze in someone else's field, the offender must make restitution from the best of their own field or vineyard. Over and over and over here, we see this idea of restitution, which is simply reparations. To give a biblical understanding, hopefully, this idea of restitution here can be seen as a civil law or a tort. It must be compensated. People must be compensated for their wrongdoing. This is in the moral fabric of our faith tradition. There must be compensation, but we should also keep in mind, I think it's helpful to see this scripture in context, that ancient Israel here was a theocracy, meaning the priests ruled in the name of God. And even though, as such, mentioned felonies were civil liabilities, the fact remains that they were still offenses against God and state. They were offenses. To do something wrong to someone was an offense not only to the state, but also to God. And restitution was to be given back to the person that was wrong. This was a godly thing to do. We can move on in other scriptures. Luke 19. You guys probably maybe at some point heard of Zacchaeus, this wee little man. We know in the church we sing about this wee little man climbing up a tree to see Jesus as he passes by. Jesus recognizes him up in a tree and calls him down. And Zacchaeus welcomes him into his home. He's welcomed into his home, and he is convicted and convinced by Jesus and who Jesus is. And he makes a statement. He says that I will pay back. He's a tax collector, by the way, might I mention. I won't even go into that. Told you I ain't preaching. I'm just summarizing quick. He is a tax collector and has stole money over and over and over for the government. And he decides, he's convicted for all of his actions, and he's in the presence of Jesus. And thus, he says, I will pay back restitution for all that I've done, up to 4 times the amount that I've wronged. He didn't just say, I'll pay back what I've taken. I will pay back up to 4 times. Here it is in the Bible, reparations. Easy to glance over when we're not willing to even give back what we've stolen. I want you to understand that we in the church have seen this passage and glared over the idea of reparations, and we've seen it only as just an idea of salvation, an idea that someone is not too bad to be saved, and and not beyond Christ's power and grace, even a rotten tax collector. So we just saw Zacchaeus as a rotten tax collector. It's funny how we in the church have dismissed Zacchaeus, his response to give restitution up to 4 times the amount of money that he had taken. Convenient, huh? I want to give you some thoughts to reimagine these 2 passages of scriptures and give you maybe the apologetic that I think we all need as allies working together against anti-racist behaviors. See, when people look at this Mosaic law, particularly Exodus 22, they're being informed by a certain Christology that maybe their pastor taught or their dogmatic seminary taught. And they will tell you that they are not subject to the Mosaic law. I'm not under the Mosaic law. I'm not under that anymore. And they use scriptures like Romans 6 and 14, and Galatians 3 and 10 that kind of tells them that they're no longer under the jurisdiction of the law, that they are under the dispensation of grace. See, the truth is that many of us Christians have used such theology to avoid responsibility for injustices. And when such theological convictions, although they may be true spiritually to some degree, it doesn't excuse the wrongs that have been done and the right way to repent, to turn away from the wrongs and to make people whole. In light of Zacchaeus' response, Christians, I think, should consider reparations as the true fruit of being transformed by Jesus. Zacchaeus did this so he could help the people he wronged and also to show how repentant he was for the sins that he had committed. Don't think Zacchaeus in that moment in the presence of Jesus said, well, I wasn't there. Or that was my great-great-great-great-grandfather. He didn't use any of those excuses because he was in the presence of God. See, reparations, this is what reparations does. It imagines. What would their life be like if the wrong didn't interfere with their advancement and tries to repair the damage? Zacchaeus, I think, many of us need to reimagine how our faith informs us about making people whole, about providing restitution. I will say this, that reparations, just bringing it full circle, only have a few minutes, this full circle now down to the brass tacks, that the U.S. has paid reparations and pays reparations every day. Farmers, fishermen, people who've lost bank accounts or pensions, people who've had bad reactions to COVID vaccine, people who've had reactions to any other vaccine, indigenous people, veterans, descendants of veterans, people who get hurt on the job, people who build nuclear bombs, people exposed to pesticides, coal miners who get black lung disease, people who lose paychecks or homes in floods and droughts and natural disasters. People who are impacted by trade agreements have all received and receive reparations. The U.S., friends, pays reparations every day, just not to Black America. Just not to Black America. I want to just end with this as a story that I have a few friends in here that I've had conversations with and been in groups talking specifically about reparations. And we were talking just about biblical reparations, and a mentor, friend, or wise man in the group, a friend of mine and wise man in the group, shared a story about his grandfather. His grandfather lived in Mississippi, and he was in an altercation with a white woman. You've seen the movie, you know the story. Grandfather was killed. My friend's father was getting an education, learning in Mississippi. His schooling was wiped out. He had to provide for his family. In that moment, the trajectory of my friends and his descendants was forever changed. I concur again with my brother Waheed that there's nothing that we could ever do that would change the wrong. It's an act of grace. It's to make as much as possible, make the wrong right. Make the wrong right. My friend is now a professor, been a professor, retired professor. He got an education, but just think what he could have been had his grandfather been able to achieve what we call the American dream and pass on to his descendants. This is the context in which we work from. I hope that I was able to offer some value to us as we have this discussion, and I look forward to learning and hearing from many of you in the near moments. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Reverend Hartman. We're going to now move on to our final speaker. Kamilah Moore is a reparatory justice scholar and an attorney with a specialization in entertainment and intellectual property transactions. As a law student, Moore contributed to human rights reports related to domestic and international human rights issues, including but not limited to racial inequality in Brazil, the human right to sanitation in Lowndes County, Alabama, and the human right to remedy for Indigenous Black women affected by racialized gender in Papua New Guinea. While studying abroad at the University of Amsterdam, Moore wrote a master thesis exploring the intersections between international law and reparatory justice for the transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, and their legacies. She earned a Juris Doctor degree from Columbia Law School in New York City, a Master of Laws degree in International Criminal Law from the University of Amsterdam, and a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Los Angeles. Kamilah Moore was appointed to the Reparations Task Force by Speaker of the Assembly, Anthony Rendon, and served as the chair of that task force. And we're really, really grateful to have you here to come and speak with us.
Hi. Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Harbor Christian Church, Reverend, for opening up the church doors for this conversation. Thank you, Adam Overton. Thank you, Gernaro, Waheed, and Reverend Lamont Hartman. So I am Kamilah Moore. I served as a past chairperson of the California Reparations Task Force. And I will give you a brief overview of what the task force worked on over the past 2 years, from 2021 to 2023, including our final recommendations and how folks can get involved. And hopefully we'll have some time to have a really good conversation and discussion, Q&A. And I guess before I proceed, I just want to uplift the names of African Americans who were deeply rooted in faith, who also championed reparations. People like, as we know, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Frederick Douglass, and many, many more. So, so the title of this presentation is On the Badges and Incidents of Slavery, and that title will make more sense as we go along. So next slide, please. So just a quick overview of the California Reparations Task Force. How did it start? So Shirley Weber, who's now California's first African-American Secretary of State, she served in the state legislature in 2019 as an assembly member. And her intern brought to her the idea around doing like state-based reparations legislation, the idea around just studying the topic of reparations and developing reparations proposals around it. And so Shirley Weber, when she was in the assembly, worked with grassroots activists and were able to get AB 3121 passed the California State Assembly and the State Senate. That created the California Reparations Task Force. It was signed into law by California Governor Gavin Newsom on September 30th, 2020. And again, this California Reparations Task Force that was created via the statute AB 3121 just gave the governor, the Speaker of the State Assembly, and the Speaker of the State Senate an opportunity to appoint 9 people to serve on this legislative advisory body. And the whole purpose, next slide. Okay, never mind. And the whole purpose was to, hold public hearings in order to, oh wait, sorry, can you go back? Sorry, I jumped a little bit. Gavin Newsom signed the legislation into law September 30th, 2020, creating this legislative advisory body. And so the task force comprised of 9 members, academics, some clergy like Reverend Amos Brown, who served as a vice chair. He was one of 16 people who were actually taught by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. He serves on the board of the NAACP, and he's a civil rights stalwart himself. You had, elected officials who served on the task force and many other folks as well. And so the first year of the task force, June 2021 to June 2022, I characterized as the study phase, where the task force essentially invited over 100 witnesses to provide personal and expert testimony on the different harms and atrocities endured by the African American community in the state of California and the United States more broadly. And then the study phase of our work was memorialized in our 500-page interim report that we released June of last year. And so as we phased away from the study phase, the last year of our work, September 22 to June 2023, was the development stage, where we stopped inviting people to provide personal expert testimony, and it was really the 9 members of the task force having really hard conversations about what the potential final recommendations could be in light of everything that we learned during the study phase. And so the end of the development phase was marked by the submission of our final report, that 1,000 pages, what we call the intellectual foundation, the evidence needed to provide the moral and political, really, justification for reparations for African Americans in the state of California and the United States as well. So the final report was officially submitted to the California State Legislature June 28th, 2023. It contained over 100 final recommendations as well. So next slide, please. Thank you. And just a little bit more context before we get to the meat of things about AB 3121, about this statute. This statute authorized the task force to hold public hearings to pursue our mission. So all of our decisions had to be made in the public. In order to inform the contents of the final report, the task force held 16 public meetings, during which it considered public comments, expert and personal witness testimony, in addition to considering voluminous material submitted to the task force via email as well. So over the course of 2 years, we heard like over 80 hours of testimony from over 200 witnesses, over 30 hours of public comment. We received over 3,000 emails and 300 phone calls. Next slide, please. So what is reparations? The layman's term definition for reparations is simply making amends for offense or harm done. I also say, reparations is not about individual guilt. And one of my colleagues, Professor Marcus Hunter, He mentioned when you study the etymology of the word reparations, it's really, it denotes a state of repair, or literally the state repairing for harms done. So it's not necessarily about individual guilt when we're talking about reparations in the context for even slavery or the afterlife of slavery, like Jim Crow, or some of the ongoing harms against the African American community, which we'll go into detail a little bit later on. So I just wanted to make that kind of clear as well. But as noted in the introduction, I also studied international law. So there's an international legal definition for reparations as well. And the task force via AB 3121, via that statute, right, we had to comport, our recommendations had to comport with human rights law standards. So that's why out of those 100 final recommendations, they all comport with those 5 types of reparations under international law. So when most Americans, when they think about reparations, they think about cash or compensation. But under international law, that's just one element. That's just one form of reparations. There's other forms of reparations. And I argue that the United States is already undergoing a process of reparations. Most of the reparations in terms of African Americans have been largely symbolic. So it's been like satisfaction. So satisfaction is a form of reparations that looks like a formal apology on behalf of the state for harming African Americans. That's something that we've seen in the past via US Congress. Satisfaction looks like the taking down of maybe racist relics or monuments. You've seen that already in the South, taking down monuments of Confederates and putting in their place different things as well. So, I mean, I have a novel argument to say we're already kind of undergoing a process of reparation. So the whole goal of this is to make the process as complete as possible. And so, yes, I already talked about, the first form of reparations, or not the first, but one of the forms of reparations, which is compensation, satisfaction, which is the more symbolic type of reparations. Then there's restitution. Restitution, that could look like taking into account unjust property takings via disproportionate use of eminent domain in African American communities. Bruce Beach in Manhattan Beach is a form of reparations under form of restitution. Rehabilitation, that looks like you taking into account the mental and physical harm and neglect of African Americans. And then guarantees of non-repetition, that looks like more institutional policy change and reform. And I'll give some more examples about that later. So domestic examples of reparations, Japanese American internment camp survivors. Ronald Reagan signed off on a policy that provided Japanese American internment camp survivors $25,000 in 1989. Rosewood, Florida is an example. The Florida State Legislature provided descendants of the Rosewood race massacre, African Americans, free college tuition to Florida state schools if they could show that they were genealogically related to someone who was a victim in that massacre. And some international examples include the denazification of Germany after the Holocaust, and to a limited extent, South African apartheid. Some direct victims of police brutality in South Africa received some form of reparations, but I say limited because the entire Black population in South Africa didn't really receive any form of reparation for the harms they endured. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick overview. It's kind of small, so apologies about that, but it gives a sample of some of the official public hearings that we had over the course of the 2 years. So we held public hearings on the following topics. We started talking about the transatlantic slave trade, the institution of slavery, and the impetus and implications of the Great Migration. What made Black folks from the South want to or need to come to California, and then what did they experience when they got here? We also held hearings on discrimination in housing, banking, tax, and labor. We held hearings on gentrification, infrastructure, and homelessness. We held hearings on entertainment, sports, arts, and culture. We talked about the unique contributions of African Americans in that space and how it was important to have that conversation, particularly in California as well. We had hearings on unequal and separate education. We had hearings on criminal legal system. We had hearings on discrimination in technology. We had a hearing on international law just to make sure that as we were exiting out the study phase and into the development phase, that we were in the process of making sure our recommendations comported with international human rights law standards. Next slide, please. And so to the left is a picture of the signing ceremony where Governor Newsom signed AB 3121 into law, and there were elected officials, the Attorney General, grassroots activists, all were there. And to the right is a picture of the 9-member task force taking our oath of office. And we had to have like our first 6 or 7 hearings virtually because we were under like a COVID order where we couldn't meet in person until April 2022. Next slide, please. So now we're getting to the meat of it, and we're almost done. So I wanted to talk about the final report, and this is about essentially the thesis, the justification for reparations, not only in the state of California, but the United States more broadly. And I also want to highlight that the California Reparations Task Force, not only did it comprise of 9 task force members, but via that statute, we were mandated to have the assistance of the California DOJ Civil Rights Enforcement Section. So many of those people who worked in the Civil Rights Enforcement Section under the California DOJ were young attorneys who helped to write this final report as well. So I would also like to give them the credit that they deserve in contributing to this report. So going back to the thesis or the justification for reparations, the argument that the task force is making. I will read a synopsis from our final report. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution commanded that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. In supporting the 13th Amendment, its co-author, Senator and Republican Lyman Trumbull of Illinois said that it is perhaps difficult to draw the line, the precise line, to say where freedom ceases and slavery begins. So I'm bringing that up to say, during that time in Congress, you had people like Senator Lyman Trumbull contemplating, how do you help this newly freed subjugated people transition from pure subjugation in all aspects of the term to freedom? Do you just leave them to the wolves and have them fend for themselves? Or is there some type of congressional action that we should take to make sure that they have, a good transition, have the resources that they need to make that transition? And so our executive summary goes on to say, the United States then experienced positively a 12-year period after the Civil War called Reconstruction, during which the federal government tried with some success to give newly freed African Americans access to basic civil rights. As just one example of the many ways in which this period reflected an expansion of rights, by 1868, so that's what, 5, 6, 7, 8, like 3 years after slavery, more than 700,000 African American men were registered to vote in the former Confederate states. These advancements came to an abrupt end after the presidential election of 1876, when federal political leaders reached a compromise which resulted in the withdrawal of federal troops from key locations in the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. And so we had that brief period of time in this country where the United States was doing what it needs to do, establish the Freedmen's Bureau, establish the Freedmen's Bank, which Frederick Douglass was the president of, after it was robbed by white board of directors, the Freedmen's Bank. People don't really know that history. That's important to note, but not getting off on a tangent, why I read that particular paragraph was to say the U.S. federal government, after the Compromise of 1876, did leave African Americans by and large to fend for themselves. After the Compromise of 1876, that's when you get the Black Codes. That's when you get the rise of the KKK. That's when you get the rise of racial terror in this country. And so even with all of that, right, moving on, in 1883, right, during this time, right, of the Black Codes, of the impetus of racial terror due to the United States reneging on its promise of Reconstruction, a lasting and durable Reconstruction. In 1883, the Supreme Court interpreted the 13th Amendment as empowering Congress to pass all laws necessary and proper for abolishing all badges and incidents of slavery. So that's relevant because even despite this lack of congressional action after that compromise, you still had the U.S. Supreme Court in 1883 articulating to Congress, you all have the responsibility and the duty via the 13th Amendment, Section 2, to pass all laws necessary and proper for abolishing all badges and incidents of slavery. Before I go to the next slide, just to give a little bit more context to make sure this makes more sense, everyone knows mainly about Section 1 of the 13th Amendment, which is that slavery exception clause, which says you can be considered a slave in this country if you're convicted of a crime, or you can, you can do an involuntary servitude if you're convicted of a crime. And we know about that mainly in the mainstream because, documentarians like Ava DuVernay in her 13th documentary. But, legal scholars, there's 13th Amendment legal scholars that don't necessarily focus on Section 1 of the 13th Amendment, on that crime exception clause, but they focus on Section 2 of the 13th Amendment. And so, next slide, please. So for instance, one of the expert witnesses that we invited to speak is a professor at Notre Dame Law School, and her name is Jennifer Mason Micka-Ward, and she's a 13th Amendment scholar, and she provided expert testimony on her law review article called Defining the Badges and Incidents of Slavery. So essentially, the argument is that Congress has abdicated its responsibility in, one, acknowledging that any badges and incidents of slavery exist, and two, defining them so that they can use their congressional action to eradicate them. So in absence of congressional action, you have 13th Amendment scholars doing the work to define the badges and incidents of slavery, something that Congress should be doing. But ultimately, for instance, Jennifer Mason comes up with a really interesting definition for badges and incidents of slavery based on those 1883 civil rights cases via the United States Supreme Court. And she says, ultimately, this article concludes that the best understanding of the badges and incidents of slavery refers to public or widespread private action aimed at any racial group or population that has previously been held in slavery or servitude. So that's a key phrase that mimics the law of slavery and has significant potential to lead to the de facto re-enslavement or legal subjugation of the targeted group. This limited definition will assist Congress in identifying ways in which it can fulfill the 13th Amendment's purpose of universal civil and political freedom. At the same time, it will provide judicially enforceable limits for the exercise of the Section 2 power. Next slide. So essentially, she's trying to make an argument about what the badges and incidents of slavery are, based on what the U.S. Supreme Court said in 1883, Congress has the power to eradicate. And so the task force, we essentially are kind of doing the work that Congress could or should be doing, identifying lingering badges and incidents of slavery that still persist in this society, post-emancipation, and that are ongoing, historic and ongoing. So some include the proliferation of KKK chapters and meetings, redlining, white-only towns and neighborhoods, law ordinances supporting segregation in schools. That's some more historic, but still post-emancipation examples of the lingering badges and incidents of slavery. So wrapping this up and going back to the thesis of this final report, this is the most important part in terms of understanding the argument that the task force is making. And so we say, however, throughout the rest of American history, instead of abolishing the badges and incidents of slavery, the United States, federal, state, and local governments, including the state of California, have perpetuated and created new iterations of these badges and incidents. The resulting harms have been innumerable and have snowballed over generations. And so the final report focuses on these harms, or we try to identify the major badges and incidents of slavery. We go on to say, so thoroughly have the effects of slavery infected every aspect of American society over the last 400 years that it is nearly impossible to identify every single badge and incident of slavery, to include every piece of evidence or describe every single harm done to African Americans. So in order to address this practical reality, the final report is only 1,000 pages. And it describes just a sample of the government actions and compounding harms, and we've resulted and organized those harms in 12 chapters, 12 specific areas of systemic discrimination. Next slide, please. So after the enslavement chapter, in each chapter there's a California breakdown that's just specific California history, and then there's a United States breakdown that's like specific United States history. And after the enslavement chapter, where we talked about California and the United States role, for instance, I learned this by being on the task force, by us inviting expert witnesses like Professor Stacy Smith from Oregon State University. I learned through her testimony, September 2022, our first substantive hearing, I learned for the first time there was slavery in California. Black people were enslaved in this state. There were over 2,000 Black people in the state of California. Yeah, it may not have been as many in the South, but I mean, still one is too many. I learned from her that not only did the state have California, we have anecdotes of slaves in Los Angeles and Sonoma County and San Bernardino throughout the state. We also learned from her that California had a fugitive slave law that was much more aggressive than the federal fugitive slave law that existed at the time, and was actually rare for states, for free states to enact. Most free states didn't enact subsequently fugitive slave laws, which deputized ordinary, typically white citizens to round up runaway slaves or even free Black people living in the state of California and having them deported to the South to be re-enslaved, or in some instances enslaved on California soil. Also, I learned through this process, California's first governor, Peter Hartman Burnett, was a racist, and before he was governor of California, he was an Oregon State legislator, and he was successful in passing Oregon's anti-Black exclusion law. And he tried to do the same thing in California, but luckily that failed. So don't want to get on a tangent, but after the enslavement portion, the rest of the chapters, again, are those 12 major areas of badges and incidents of slavery that the task force identified, which include racial terror. In each of these chapters, there's a historic component and a more present and contemporary component. And by historic, I mean literally like, 1900s to 1960s, which is not historic at all. This is, you know what I'm saying? But contemporary, I mean like things that Black Americans are going through right now and today. So yeah, the badges and incidents of slavery include racial terror, political disenfranchisement, housing segregation, separate and unequal education, racism in environment and infrastructure, the pathologizing of Black families, control over creative, cultural, and intellectual life, stolen labor and hindered opportunity, the unjust legal system, mental and physical harm and neglect, and the wealth gap. And the rest of this presentation, I'll just briefly mention a data point or a fact from each of these badges and incidents of slavery. So I already went through some facts on the enslavement chapter, particularly California-specific facts, but nationally, the task force held that the foundation of America's wealth was built on trafficked African peoples and their descendants, built by their forced labor and their bodies as they were bought and sold as commodities. American government at all levels allowed or participated in exploiting, abusing, terrorizing, and murdering people of African descent so that mostly white Americans could profit. So racial terror is the next slide. And so, nationally, what did the task force say about this concept, this first badge or incident of slavery? We say nationally, after slavery, white Americans frequently aided by the government maintained the badges of slavery by carrying out violence and intimidation against African Americans for decades. Racial terror pervaded every aspect of post-slavery Black life and prevented African Americans from building the same wealth and political influence as white Americans. In California, the task force found that KKK chapters were established all over the state as early as the 1920s. During that time, California sometimes even held more KKK events than Mississippi or Louisiana. And many of California's KKK members were prominent individuals who held positions in civil leadership and police departments, like the town of Brea, for example. In 1924 through 1936, 2/3 of the fire chiefs belonged to KKK chapters, 5 of the first 8 mayors, 6 of 10 councilmen on the Board of Trustees, and half of the treasurers, engineers, clerks, and marshals. Next slide, please. And so the next badge or incident of slavery we identified as a task force was political disenfranchisement. So on a national level, what does that look like? African Americans have pursued equal participation since before the Civil War, but federal, state, and local governments of the United States have suppressed and continue to suppress Black votes. This picture is Republican African American candidate for the California 55th Assembly District, Rayfield Lundy, in 1952 with a friend is inspecting a burnt cross outside of his home in Los Angeles, California. In California, California also passed and enforced laws to prevent Black Californians from accumulating political power. California did not allow Black men to vote until 1879, and the state also passed many voter suppression laws that were used in the South, like prohibiting individuals convicted of felonies from voting, and even had poll taxes and literacy tests. Next slide, please. So the next badge or incident of slavery is housing segregation. Nationally, we talk about how government actors working with private individuals actively segregated America into Black and white neighborhoods through a process known as redlining. Although this system through a process of racially restrictive covenants, Although this system of segregation was called Jim Crow in the South, it existed by less obvious but effective means throughout the entire country, including in California. So, you had the process of racially restrictive covenants that segregated people by race, and you also had redlining, which aided in the disinvestment of Black communities, marked Black communities with a scarlet letter saying, banks, institutions, stay away from these areas. These areas are not profitable or places where you want to invest. And California, like elsewhere in the country, white Californians used violence to enforce the racial hierarchy created during slavery by preventing African Americans from moving into desirable white neighborhoods. In fact, violent incidents in California rose in the 1950s and 60s after courts declared racially restrictive covenants unenforceable. Like for instance, oh, could you go back to the other slide? Like for instance, William Bailey and Roger Duncan, who look at the wreckage in Bailey's living room after a bomb exploded in the house. Duncan's house directly across the street was also bombed at the same time, and a note was left threatening all of the Black families on the street in Los Angeles if they didn't move out, and that was in 1952. So the next badge or incident of slavery is separate and unequal education. Nationally, we found that non-white school districts get $23 billion less than predominantly white districts. And California, we found, remains the 6th most segregated state in the country in terms of education. We also note how education in California is, primarily funded by property taxes, but when you take into account California's history and being complicit in racially restrictive covenants and redlining, it seems incredibly unfair then to base, funding on, property taxes when that mostly Black Americans were relegated to the projects, relegated to lower communities that weren't able to, rise in property value like other areas in the state or for other communities. Next slide, please. Racism in the environment and infrastructure is the next slide. The next badge or incident of slavery, just to briefly talk about that, for instance, compared to other Americans, African Americans are 75% more likely to live near hazardous waste or refining facilities. Black Americans are often living at a more higher rate, living in substandard housing than other communities as well. Next slide, please. The next slide, the next badge or incident of slavery is pathologizing the Black family. So that talks about all the stereotypes that Black folks have had to deal with and Black families have had to deal with over generations. And so nationally, they say government policies and practices at all levels have destroyed Black families throughout American history. After the Civil War, Southern state governments re-enslaved children by making them apprentices. But there's other examples of government policies and practices that the task force mentions around that. In California, in terms of pathologizing the Black family, we found that California trends in child welfare, juvenile justice, and disciplinary action in schools. We found that African American youth are also overrepresented in foster care. Next slide, please. So the 9th chapter and the 9th badge or incident of slavery is control over creative and cultural and intellectual life. And this chapter talks about the vast contributions that Black Americans have made in the arts and the sciences. For instance, we found that over 1,000 patents were stolen essentially from Black Americans. They were not able to receive credit for their inventions in this country, we found. Nationally, we talk about during slavery, state governments controlled and dictated the forms and content of African American artistic and cultural production. After the Civil War, governments and politicians embraced minstrelsy, which was a popular and cultural makers' access to leisure sites, business licenses, and funding for lifestyle activities that were offered to white people. In California, city governments decimated thriving Black neighborhoods with vibrant artistic communities like the Fillmore in San Francisco. Central Avenue in Los Angeles was also a vibrant African American community. There was a vibrant beach cities in Manhattan Beach and Santa Monica for African Americans that were destroyed, either by the freeway construction or by unjust property takings via eminent domain. And then this picture is Little Richard, obviously famous singer, performed the song Tutti Frutti, and he talked about his experience protesting outside of his record company in the 80s, about how he sold the rights to the song for a reported $50 and received half a cent for each record sold. And he talked about how he felt like he was taken essentially advantage of, which happened to a lot of African American artists when we talk about copyright and music law and stuff like that. Next slide, please. So stolen labor and hindered opportunity is the 10th chapter, the 10th badge or incident of slavery. Nationally, we say it is undeniable that the labor of enslaved Africans literally built the infrastructure of the nation, infrastructure that still exists to this very day, like the White House, like the Capitol, like many different freeways and other infrastructure, particularly in the South, but all across the country, even in the North, Wall Street, we can go on and on. So yes, it is undeniable that the labor of enslaved Africans built the infrastructure of the nation, produced its main agricultural products for domestic consumption and export, and filled the nation's coffers. Since then, federal, state, and local government actions directly segregated and discriminated against African Americans. In California, when we talk about stolen labor and hindered opportunity, we talk about how cities, public institutions were slow in hiring Black Americans. For instance, several California cities did not hire Black workers until the 1940s. And certain public sectors continued to avoid hiring Black workers even as late as 1970. For instance, the San Francisco Fire Department had no Black firefighters before 1955. And by 1970, when Black residents made up 14% of the city's population, only 4 of the department's 1,800 uniformed firefighters were Black. Next slide, please. Getting towards the end, the 11th chapter, the 11th badge or incident of slavery the task force identified is an unjust legal system. Nationally, we found that American government at all levels criminalized African Americans for social control and to maintain an economy based on exploited Black labor. The United States, as we know, imprisons the most people in the world, and most people in prison are Black Americans, descendants of slaves. California, like the rest of the country, stops, shoots, kills, and imprisons more African Americans than their share of the population. Data shows that law enforcement most frequently reported taking no further action during a stop with the person they perceived to be Black, suggesting there may have been no legal basis for the stop. African Americans are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police. And when we published this interim report in 2022, we found that 88% increase in anti-Black hate crimes from 2019 to 2020. And also, African Americans are the #1 victims and have been the number one victims despite popular belief of hate crimes in this nation's history. Since this nation's conception, that's corroborated by statistics on the FBI's website, what we found in the task force as well. And African Americans are the #1 victims of hate crimes in the state of California and for instance, in the city of Los Angeles. And there was a really good article that came out, I think in the LA Times a couple of weeks ago, that said despite this data, despite Black Americans being the #1 victims of hate crimes in LA, for instance, the city of LA has deployed no resources to educate the city residents about that, or deployed any resources to fix that data, to fix those statistics. Next slide, please. So this 12th chapter is mental and physical harm and neglect. The picture to the left is of medical students in Maryland School of Medicine in 1898. Conducting experiment on a mutilated Black American woman's body. And what is significant to point out is what's sketched out on the side of the table, which was their mantra for their school class. Her loss is our gain. And that is indicative of kind of a lot of things. But the system of racism in medicine, for instance, is deeply rooted. as this picture suggests. And so what are the present day implications of that? Nationally, the government actions described in the report have had devastating effect on the health of African Americans. Compared to white Americans, African Americans live shorter lives and are more likely to suffer and die from nearly all known diseases and medical conditions compared to white Americans. California, these national trends are similar. The life expectancy of an average Black Californian was 75.1 years, 6 years shorter than the state average. Black babies in California are more likely to die in infancy, and Black mothers giving birth die at a rate of almost 4 times higher than the average California resident. And compared with white Californians, Black Californians are more likely to have diabetes and die from cancer or be hospitalized for heart disease. Next slide, please. So this is the last badge or incident of slavery that the task force identified, and it is the wealth gap. And so California doesn't have a statewide study to assess the wealth gap between white Californians and Black Californians per se. So that was actually one of our recommendations, is to for the state legislature to maybe deploy some resources to do that work if that's what they would like to do. But nationally, in 2019, white households owned 9 times more assets than Black households. Nationally, it'll take 228 years for the racial wealth gap to close between Black Americans and white Americans. We note, for instance, the federal and California Homestead Acts are examples of 2 examples of many of public policy that excluded African Americans and allowed for mostly white Americans to use these policies to build wealth. And there's present day implications of those types of policies. And so, for instance, the federal, and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., to close, also mentioned this many times before his assassination. He talked about while Congress refused to give the Negro any land, at the same time was giving away millions and millions of acres of land to newly arriving white immigrants, which meant, Martin Luther King said, that the United States was willing to undergird its newly arriving white peasant economic class with an economic floor while excluding that same opportunity for African Americans. And so the present day implications of that, the task force found through our expert testimony, 46 million Americans are living descendants and reap the wealth benefits of the federal and California Homestead Act. Either they still have the land in their family or they sold it off and it's part of their generational wealth. That's nearly a quarter of the US population, white Americans, who have benefited from those 2 public policy, types of public policy that was completely exclusionary and excluded African Americans by and large. So next slide, please. So what were some of the final recommendations? Out of the over 100 recommendations, many of them are universal based. All of our recommendations are going to benefit if they're implemented every single Californian, despite your background. There are some that are more obviously on its face universal in nature. There are some that are race conscious, and that most of them, though, because California prohibits race-conscious remedies in contracting, education, and employment, and we know the federal government has done the same thing via the US Supreme Court recently. Most of our recommendations are either universal or lineage-based, narrowly tailored, that's language from constitutional law, narrowly tailored to apply to descendants of slaves as an under-inclusive proxy term. But nevertheless, some of the final recommendations include establishing and funding community wellness centers in Black communities as a way to eradicate the badge or incident of slavery called mental and physical harm and neglect. or funding research to study the mental health issues within California's Black youth population to address rising suicide rates among Black youth, which Black youth in California lead as the #1 victims of suicide. Final recommendation for unjust legal system. We recommended increasing efforts to restore the voting rights of formerly incarcerated persons and provide access to those who are currently incarcerated and eligible to vote. That's actually some legislation that's been introduced in this past session by Assemblymember Isaac Bryan. To eradicate the Badgett incident called separate and unequal education. We recommended to increase funding to schools through the local control funding through a race-neutral way, a race-neutral formula to address racial disparities in schools. We also recommended free college tuition to descendants of slaves at Cal States and UCs. For housing segregation, we recommended providing property tax relief to descendants living in formerly red-line neighborhoods. Again, tying that remedy to the institutional harm to help descendants of slaves purchase or construct a new home, or provide share appreciation loans and subsidized down payments, mortgages, and homeowners insurance. We also recommended the creation of a new state agency, tentatively called the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency, that pays homage to the Freedmen's Bureau that once existed in this country. The idea and the vision for this state agency would be to provide descendants of slaves ongoing direct reparatory justice services, and to provide oversight over existing state agencies to make sure Black Americans' rights, privileges, and immunities are not being abridged. And that goes back to reparations in the form of guarantees of non-repetition, one of those 5 forms of reparations under international law. So that is the end of my presentation. Go to the next slide. Ways that you can get engaged for folks who are just now learning about the task force or who knew a little bit about it but want to do a deeper dive. Everything that the task force has discussed over the past 2 years is going to be on the California Attorney General or DOJ's website for posterity, forever. All of our meetings, all of our minutes, all of the videos, all the past testimony, all of the report and all of its contents will be on that website forever, oag.ca.gov/AB 3121. There's grassroots organizations that you can subscribe to their mailing list, like California Reparations.info, or even the DOJ's mailing list as well. You can search our past hearings as well on YouTube, through the DOJ's YouTube channel or through community activist channels like ETM Media. You can also follow me on Twitter, or you can stay engaged through my website. But I also brought, as an action step, as a next step for folks, brought some flyers that are out there. And those flyers kind of give folks info about SB 490, which is that piece of legislation that would create the state agency, the Freedmen Affairs Agency. That's one of the over 100 recommendations that has already, since the task force released our final report June 28th, has already been introduced as potential legislation, the first and only of the 100 recommendations that has been introduced thus far. And that was by State Senator Stephen Bradford. So the flyers are from a community organization that I support. I'm not in the organization, but it's the flyers are from CJEC, Coalition for a Just and Equitable California. CJEC served as one of the 7 community organizations that helped spread awareness about the task force over the course of the 2 years. So if folks are interested in learning more, please take a flyer, or you can just learn more information by going to that website, CaliforniaReparations.info, or going to CJEC's website as well. So I'll leave off by saying, I recently did an interview where at my church, at All Nations Baptist Church of Church of God in Christ on the east side of LA. And I just, I go to church all the time. It sustained me in this work. And I give all the glory to God, to be quite frank. And in the interview, I mentioned a Bible verse, or what I thought mentioned reparations, and it's Proverbs 14:9. And it says, "Fools mock at reparations, but among the upright there is favor." So I just want to thank you all for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to any questions and comments you have. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Kamilah Moore. I'm going to introduce my collaborators, Caroline Kaufman and Sarah Tees, to tell you about what's about to happen now.
Thank you. We have come with our bodies to this place to hear about what has been done to bodies, and our minds are swimming with facts, and we might have feelings. And I invite you to breathe. If you feel comfortable, to just remember that you have a body, that it's 2023, and we don't know how to fix this, but we trust that with all of our hearts and all of our bodies and these minds that we get to use, that we can move forward with this in a good way. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I want to invite you into our breakout sessions, but they're going to be shortened by a little in the interest of time. So on the back of your packets is a question and answer, a breakout group notes page with questions for you to answer. What we ask you to do in the interest of time is to share who you are, where you're from, and any questions you may have for the panel. And then your facilitator in your group is going to collect those questions, and a selection of those questions will be asked of the panel back in here. Also, though, find an exit buddy. Adam really wants us all to make friends with each other, so find an exit buddy. Who are you going to connect with? Who are you going to see again in a different space and have a conversation about moving this work forward? And please join us over in Cersei Hall for our quick breakout session. Thank you.
Oh, and hit the snack table if you need to.
Yes.